This is Open to Debate. I'm John Donvan. Hi, everybody. Today's debate focuses on whether we should get rid of or hold on to something that has been a part of our lives for all of our lives, unless you happen to live in Arizona or Hawaii. Any guesses? Well, let's play you some recent news coverage talking about the thing that we're going to talk about.
Who doesn't love an extra hour of sleep in the fall or later sunsets in the summer? It would seem like Donald Trump doesn't.
President Trump put this out on Truth Social last night. He said the Republican Party will use its best efforts to eliminate daylight savings time.
Republicans will push to eliminate daylight saving time, calling it, quote, inconvenient and costly.
You don't mind changing the clocks?
I don't mind changing the clock.
He's not making any sense. No.
Either way, I'm fine with it.
So there you've heard it. This is going to be a debate about daylight savings time, that twice a year clock forward, clock backward move that the nation goes through. This is the clock forward moment that's about to come up for all of us, except in those two states that I mentioned, which long ago opted to stay standard time all the time. As you heard, this system, which has been in place for decades now, is definitely in the sights of the president, but he is not the only detractor. Daylight savings time annoys a lot of people, and they want it gone. At the same time, a lot of people love daylight savings time, and they would hate to see it go. What is the case for daylight savings time, and what's the case against it? That's what we're going to debate. And along the way, we'll take some time to find out how it got started and when and why, which should be interesting if for you it's just been there all along this time. So here's the precise question we're taking on for a special bonus podcast release. Is it time to end daylight savings time? So let's please meet our debaters answering yes to that question, saying it is time to end it. I want to welcome Joan Costa-i-Font. He's an economist who specializes in health economics. He's a professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he leads the Aging and Health Incentives Lab. And his work examines the intersection of economic well-being and health, particularly the interaction between aging and inequality. Joan, thanks so much for joining us on Open to Debate. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Delighted to be here.
And here to answer no to the question, saying it is not time to end daylight savings time, I want to welcome Binyamin Appelbaum. Binyamin is a journalist and a member of the New York Times editorial board, where he is the lead writer on economic and business op-eds. He's been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Journalism. And in 2019, he came out with a book called The Economist's Hour: False Profits, Free Markets, and the Fracture of Society, which charts the rise of our reliance on economics and economists to determine our political priorities. Binyamin, welcome to the program. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
So let's get to our opening statements. We want to give each of you a chance to tell us why you're taking the position of yes or no. Joan, you're up first. Again, the question is it time to end daylight savings time? You're saying yes. Please tell us why.
Well, thank you so much again. And, essentially my argument boils down to 4 points. The first one, as a health economist, I would say health is the main reason. We know that health deterioration is the main consequence of the existence of daylight saving time. Evidence of increases in heart attacks, spiking accidents, suicides, medical errors, strokes, all happening around the time of the time change. And we have estimated at the LSE that the cost of this would be around or equivalent to $800 of income a year in terms of well-being. So, this detrimental effect of the daylight saving time has a lot to do with the fact that most Americans and most individuals across the world are sleep deprived. We tend to be time poor. So a small change in our routines, we are creatures of routine, has a large impact on our mental health, the probability of suffer from depression and anxiety. And that has a lot to do with the fact that our social clock and our body clock often gets disconnected because of this change. So, this is an effect that is very real, and it affects particularly vulnerable populations, particularly older people and children, so it creates significant health inequalities. So that would be my first argument, health. Second argument has to do with the fact that it doesn't really deliver on its main purpose. So it was supposed to save us energy, and it was supposed to encourage productivity, and it's not doing any of that. So it doesn't really save much energy because heating and electricity often have opposite effects. And same with productivity. There is recent studies that show actually that there's very little effect, if anything, on productivity. The third argument has to do with democracy. So there's a majority of both the population in the US and Europe. The US Senate, the European Parliament have all voted to end daylight saving time. In fact, a number of countries do not implement it in the first place: Turkey, Uruguay, Mexico, and others. And actually, during the period of wars, for instance, the Second World War, wartime actually removed daylight saving time. So we can go without it, and it doesn't seem that it makes much of a difference. And finally, I would say, as a matter of principle, is a one-size-fits-all intrusion beyond the intrusion that time zones have on our life. And it tends to serve commercial and political purposes. So it does increase perhaps consumption, and it can be used sometimes for political purposes. I'm thinking of Turkey changing the time that the time is changed in the year to increase the electoral support of the incumbent, or Franco, for instance, aligning Spain with the German time at the time of the Second World War, purely to align with the Axis. Rather than thinking in terms of like the well-being of the population. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Joan. And now, Binyamin, it's your turn. Again, you are answering no to the question, is it time to end daylight savings time? And here's your chance to tell us why that no is your argument.
Thank you. Yes, I'm here to defend daylight savings time. And to do that, I actually want to go back to the beginning of daylight savings time, because I think the story of how we got to this point is really instructive. The guy who dreamed up daylight savings time was a postal clerk in New Zealand named George Hudson, who liked to collect bugs. He was an entomologist in the evenings. And he realized that during the summer in New Zealand, the sun rose long before he woke up, but it set while he was still awake, indeed, some time before he intended to go to bed. And he regarded this as a waste, an unfortunate waste that was limiting the amount of time that he had to enjoy during the course of the day. And so he proposed a summertime shift to maximize the hours of post-work sunlight, in his case to collect bugs, but for other people to do whatever they want. And indeed, at around the same time in England, a man named William Willett, who had the hobby of playing golf, arrived independently at the same conclusion, that it would be nice to have more time to play golf in the evening. And he became the most successful and articulate advocate for the creation of daylight savings time. So it's, I think, important in the first place to say that all of the ideas about daylight saving time being energy efficient or better for productivity were after-the-fact rationalizations. The original motive for daylight saving time, and the reason that it remains a good idea, is that people like to have more time in the sunshine. And this is particularly true the further you get from the equator. So it is absolutely the case that many countries don't use daylight saving time. If you look at a map of who does, what you find is that they are people from countries like William Willett and George Hudson, which is to say far from the equator, because that's where the differences in sunrise and sunset over the course of the year are most dramatic, and therefore where the value of shifting the way we keep time in the summer is most beneficial. Now, I want to stipulate that the changes in time are really painful and hugely unpopular. Nobody likes springing forward. Nobody likes falling back. So how did we end up with a system where we're doing that, where we've got 34 weeks a year here in the United States of daylight savings and 18 of standard time? Why are we making that shift twice a year? Why don't we just stay on standard time? Well, I think it's important to go back also to the beginning of time, as it were, because it's easy to think of standard time as some kind of state of nature. But actually, through most of human history, we rose with the sun and we were put to bed by darkness. When people started dividing the day into segments, they did it as a percentage of daylight, not as a fixed number of minutes. Roman hours varied from 40 to 90 minutes. It's only with the advent of the industrial era that we arrive at the idea of standard time and begin to impose a fixed schedule on people, not as the natural order of things, but quite the opposite, as an effort to mechanize our lives, to make us more efficient and productive and predictable. And that artificial construct is pressed down upon society, and it has enormous benefits. I'm not here to argue against time or time zones. But what I will say is that something was lost along the way, which is the flexibility that existed throughout most of human history to adjust our lives to the natural variation of the seasons. And what daylight savings time does in a very small way is it restores a little bit of that flexibility. It allows us to adjust our lives to the variations of the seasons so that we can enjoy a little bit more daylight during our waking hours. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Binyamin, and thanks to both of you for your opening statement. I just want to reiterate what I think I've heard you say. Joan, in arguing that we should end daylight savings time, you made several points. You say that the current switching back and forth is bad for health. It throws people out of their natural body clock rhythms. You also make the case that it does not, the argument that it would save energy does not actually get borne out. I note that that was not the thrust of your opponent's argument. I want to bring that up now. And you also point to its unpopularity, that a lot of people are very unhappy with it. I've seen polls that I can report that suggest 75% of Americans are fed up with it, fed up with making the change. And you also talk about the fact that who really benefits from it are businesses, because it gets people to spend more time in consumption, and that priority sometimes gets lost in the conversation. And Binyamin, in pushing back against it, I hear you say that sunlight and daylight is a precious commodity, and we should be able to enjoy as much of it as possible, that not doing so is a waste of light. And you also point out that it's showing up in nations that benefit more from the fact that they're farther away from the equator. They have those great swings in daylight apportionment throughout the year, and that shows that it actually is serving useful function, that the nations that benefit from it are actually doing it. And you also make a really interesting philosophical argument that time is a flexible concept. It often has been, and the ability to kind of shift things around with time is a part of being, I guess, the advantage of being human, that we can make those decisions for ourselves. And you say, why not? Why not do that? I'd like to spend a little bit more time before we get into the point by point of your arguments to just talk a little bit more, because I think it would be interesting to people to learn a little bit more about how we got here. And I really appreciated, Binyamin, that you took us through that process that shows us, first of all, that it's a pretty new concept. It's only been around for about 100 years. In the United States, it was only put into place for the first time during the First World War. Then it was taken off. Then it was put back on. And then it was only in 1966 that it was standardized across the United States, that there would be a system of shifting back and forth that states could opt into or opt out of. As we've mentioned, Hawaii and Arizona have opted out, except for the Navajo Nation in Arizona does do daylight savings time. There are also other places, American territories, that have opted out, including Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, and some others. But what I did find interesting in terms of the energy argument that both of you, or that you kind of brushed aside, Joan, is that the first industrialized nation to go to daylight savings time was Germany during the First World War. Germany and Austria-Hungary, the nations that the United States and the Allies were fighting. And their stated reason was, in fact, that they wanted to save coal, that people were burning coal through electricity and other means, and they wanted to preserve coal, and saw going to daylight savings time would be a way to save the costs of burning that coal, and essentially a conservation movement, because more people there would be more daylight, less need for artificial light. Joan, do you the fact that the Germany saw that economic justification tells you what? Were they just wrong about it, since that was their primary motive at the time?
No, I would say probably was right at the time. And the time where most energy would come from coal, and where heating systems would not be the ones that we have today. There will be no electric appliances at home. These days, that's not the case. Most of the studies out there show either no effects or, marginal positive or negative effects that would not really back up the idea of having a daylight saving time on the first place. There is even some studies showing that the changing time clock is detrimental for the environment. So what it was truly irrational back in time might not necessarily be rational today.
Okay, I hear you on that. Very interesting answer on it. And I want to take that to you, Binyamin. You said that fundamentally the initial impulse for daylight savings time came from, a guy wanted to play golf and a guy wanted to collect bugs, that it wasn't the energy issue. But I also want to bring the example of Germany in the First World War back to you, that it was about energy.
Yeah, so I think that some of the best data that we have on this, I want to agree with Juan basically that there's no evidence that this is, useful as an energy saving device. It may once have been. Some of the best data that we have on this is from the state of Indiana, which adopted daylight saving time and did so in part on the rationale that there would be less electricity consumed because people would need to use less lighting. And what they found is that was offset by increased use of air conditioning. And so, Germany didn't have air conditioning during the First World War. Possibly they may have realized some energy savings, but in modern times, what we've seen pretty consistently is that, sort of that type of basic economic argument for daylight saving time, it doesn't really hold up. And I'm willing to stipulate that that's not one of the reasons we should be doing it.
All right. So we're going to take the purported energy savings off the table. Neither of you believe that that's a real thing. So I now want to return to you, Binyamin, with the argument that Joan was making about the impacts on health, that it's bad for us, that there are statistics suggesting higher rate of heart attacks and strokes and car accidents. What's your response to that?
So I think it's important to step back, and this actually goes to the point about democracy as well. There's a really important distinction here between changing time and which system of time you use. So many of the negative health effects are associated with the fact that we change time. And if, for example, you just kept daylight saving time all year round, it would presumably ameliorate many of those effects. There's some evidence that standard time may as such be healthier than daylight saving time, but the most of the effects that Juan is talking about and that studies have established are associated with the change, not with daylight saving time as such. And that's true, actually, for this question of what does democracy say about this issue as well. These polls in the European Union and in the United States that are widely cited showing that the vast majority of people in these places oppose the current system, the opposition is to a change in time. If you ask them, what would you like instead, which the European Union specifically didn't do, but polls in the United States have done, then they're split. Then what you find out is they don't agree at all. Lots of people want daylight saving time to be permanent. Lots of people want standard time to be permanent. They have good reasons for it. And in fact, if you look in the United States, what you see is that people who live further south tend to be more in favor of permanent daylight saving time for good reason.
I was pretty sure I heard you say in your opening that in this notion of keeping flexibility that you're defending the switchability.
I believe in it, yes, but I'm just saying that one should be careful about interpreting the data here, that the data does not show that people have democratically risen up to demand permanent standard time. What they are objecting to is the change. I think that what is misleading even about that is that they don't agree on what should come next. And my defense of daylight saving time is basically that it is the best available compromise, that what you hear when you look at that data that shows that some people want permanent standard time and some people want permanent daylight saving time is that both have benefits. And balancing those benefits is what we're trying to do here.
Okay, back to you, Joan. There was a lot said there, whatever you'd like to respond to.
Yeah. Well, I would agree. Human beings generally prefer stability. They prefer no change happening, so that there is this effect. But even when we look at the proportion that would like standard time or daylight saving time, what we see is that probably daylight saving time would still make a majority. So long as one group would compensate the other, that could potentially still hold. The way to compensate that would be, for instance, thinking of transfers or thinking of perhaps differences in opening hours across the territory. Schools could, for instance, open at different points in time. So it would have knock-on consequences on other routines that we have in society inevitably. But clearly, I would argue that there is actually a consensus for a change, and that this change is not obvious, and that's why it hasn't happened. I would fully agree with Binyamin that actually the main reason it hasn't happened is because we disagree on which would be the best time to set. In Europe, actually, the main disagreement is geographical, so between north and south of Europe, right? In the US, probably that's true too, but on top of that, we know that there is even variation within each state, because states are so large that you could even find like wide variation within state. So that's the main reason why it hasn't happened. But the fact that it hasn't happened because of that reason doesn't mean that we would be better off changing it.
I was going to ask you why you think it hasn't happened. One thing I found of note is that our present system was standardized in 1966 in the United States with what was called the Uniform Time Act. And because things had been shifting all over the place since World War II, they decided to set up a system. If any state wanted to opt in, here's what the time is, and we're all going to stick with that. But since 2018, there's been a bill in the Senate called the way they've changed the names of acts, that was called the Uniform Time Act. Now it's the Sunshine Protection Act. And it hasn't passed, but it's a bill that would, as I understand it, would go to what is now savings time all the time to keep in keeping with our circadian rhythms. And I want to take this to you, since Joan kind of touched on this. Why this bill hasn't passed, do you think, Binyamin?
I think the reason is, as I suggested earlier, that our current system actually is the democratic alternative. And I think that's important to remember. Like, this system was not created by fiat or by, some single person. Congress implemented this system in 1966. In its judgment, it was what the American people wanted. It expanded it in 1986 and in 2005, both times extending the period of daylight saving time to the current 34 weeks. There is a large caucus in Congress that, defends daylight saving time and would like it to be permanent. There are people who think standard time should be permanent. And what our political process has consistently produced every time it has adjudicated this issue is a compromise in which we change the clocks twice a year. So the idea that this is not the democratic outcome strikes me as, frankly, ahistorical. This is exactly the outcome that our democracy has decided
What
upon.
is the reason that only a third of nations are doing this system and that more nations are dropping out after having experimented with it? What does it tell us?
I mean, I think if you look at a map of the world, what you'll see is that democracies that are distant from the equator overwhelmingly use a system in which the clocks are changed twice a year. And the countries that don't, Russia, China would be two big ones, are places where the idea, the appeal of having, a uniform, strict system imposed upon the population, whether they like it or not, is something that's politically feasible in a way that it's not in countries that have democracies. So to me, the fact that Egypt or Indonesia or, countries in Latin America are not using this doesn't tell us very much, because for them it doesn't make any sense. No. If you're close to the equator, there is no argument for doing this. The argument for doing this is as you move away from the equator. And if you look at democracies that are distant from the equator, they overwhelmingly do this.
So that's really interesting that you're bringing sort of the factor of geography, where you're located on the map, because these time zones that are set up across the United States, there are 4 time zones, and your sunrise in a time zone depends on whether you're more to the east or more to the west of that time zone. And I want to bring that fact to you, Joan, that if we were to shift to one system in the United States, and I realize that I don't know if our listeners understand that you're talking to us from London, and you're familiar with the system here. You're also familiar with the European system. If we were to shift to a single time zone, and if that time zone were the summer, this time when your opponent is saying people like having that extra night at light, that's bought at the expense of light in the morning. And some further research has told me that in New York City, in January, the sunrise would be at 8:20 in the morning if we went on summertime all the time. And in parts of Montana and North Dakota and Michigan, sunrise wouldn't happen until 9:30 in the morning, because we've made that choice. And this is leading up to my question to you, which if we're gonna drop one of these, which one should we be choosing? Because summertime would give people all those evenings on the golf course if they're golfers, or shoppers if that's the incentive. But how do we deal with the fact that the mornings would be so dark now?
Well, I mean, here the point I would make is the same I made before. Is that it's about opening hours, right? So we know that sleep researchers have established a consensus for standard time. The reason being that early exposure to light has an impact on our circadian rhythm. It affects our exposure to disease. It affects our cardiovascular health. So it is quite important that we do that. So if we do care about our health, that will be the choice, and we would have to actually adjust other. There will be a cost to it. Any decision that we make would have gainers and losers, right? And inevitably, the golfers will probably have to compromise and accept that they will have to actually probably play an hour less of golf,
or get up in the morning earlier. Yeah.
Or get up in the morning earlier, exactly. But early exposure to light is actually important. I just would like to just point out as well on the previous point on democracies. I mean, for instance, we have Uruguay, which is clearly a democracy far away from the equator and doesn't have the daylight saving time. So there are exceptions always to the rule. Generally speaking, I would say large countries like Russia would not have daylight saving time. Because typically there is a significant cost in such an heterogeneous setting, and I would say the U.S. would be similar. It has 4 time zones, so it creates a bit of a mess. On top of the fact that there's some states that do not follow it, right? So it creates these coordination effects, and we know that there are even effects on exchange rates and even on stock market activity resulting from daylight saving time, which is interesting.
Let me just ask you, just as an intuitive matter, hearing that the changeover period correlates to an increase in heart attacks and strokes, which I understand is documented, it just surprises me because on any given day, any one of us might have to do an early call, might have to get an alarm, or the kids might wake up early or something like that. And the notion that early wake up is going to be associated with a really serious hit to your health, to the degree of a heart attack or a stroke. Is that counterintuitive, or is that actually a real thing that there's just I just haven't paid attention to?
No, it is actually the fact that it happens recurrently, that it happens across the board. It's not just a one-off effect. It's not you that you happen to just wake up. It's actually everybody that is exposed to that effect. It basically changes one's routines, and what we show actually in our research is that the effects are still there, actually even a week after the time change. So it's not like a short-term effect, a grumpiness effect. It's much more than that.
So it's also because you've had to change permanently. You didn't have one bad day and go back to your regular schedule. You're doing a tectonic shift in your schedule, you're saying?
Yes, and everybody is doing it. So that creates expectations on you. Right. So altogether, what we see is that there is a misadaptation, particularly amongst families with children, individuals senior individuals, etc. Right. So it does create inequalities. Maybe young, healthy individuals have less of an effect, but it does impact on those that are weaker in society. So
Binyamin, you have not refuted the health impact, and I think you've acknowledged there are costs. But I want to know, the costs that Joan is talking about, why are they outweighed by the benefits? How seriously do you take these statistics in terms of car accidents, strokes, heart attacks?
I think that there's very good evidence that there are real costs associated with this. The exact quantification of them, I think, is more art than science, but there's no doubt that it exists. It is disruptive to human life in ways that are consequential. And I think, that is always a question that we as a society face, is which things have such negative costs that we want to prohibit them or not to do them as a society. Watching television after 8 p.m. is something that scientists warn is bad for your sleep. Drinking in the evening, not good for your sleep. Traveling imposes exactly the same health consequences as a shift as the shift to daylight savings time. If you go to a new time zone, you're doing to yourself what you do when you change the clocks in your home. There are lots of decisions that we make that are bad for our health. And the question that I think is relevant here is not, is this bad for our health? It's clear that you can measure negative effects, but how do we compare those downsides to the benefits of this system? And to me, the argument for benefits is twofold. The first is just that people should get to decide that for themselves. And when they have democratically decided that, they have decided to implement the system that we have. And I think we should respect that. We can inform them about the negative consequences, and maybe eventually they'll make a different decision. But to date, this is the way that it's gone. The second argument is I think there are measurable benefits as well. And I think, it's not just a question of do people get to play golf for an hour? It's a question of, people being able to live out their lives in the way that they want, to take advantage of that daylight. We know that darkness throws people off. It makes them sad. It depresses them. There are negative effects on health associated with sunrise at 10 a.m., which is what you get awfully close to in Western Michigan if you're on daylight savings time in the winter there. There are negative effects associated with the sun going down at 6:30 p.m. in the middle of the summer, which is what you get at the other end of the time zone if you're on standard time in summer. And so the idea that there's some system that would, be perfectly healthy, I think is wrong. As soon as we went, the natural state of things was that, you woke up when the sun came up and you went to sleep when the sun went down. And as an industrial society, we've imposed a set of artificial rules on time that clearly has health consequences. And there is no system of artificial rules we can impose that won't have health consequences. The question we're really confronting is, which system do we want?
Joan, I'd love you to respond to that since health is your expertise.
Yeah, so I think that the problem with daylight saving time is that it's a one size fits all. So if you choose to travel to a country and bear the consequences, that's your choice. Here, you don't have a choice. You are imposed a change in time that, whether you like it or not, right? So, and it's recurrent. It happens twice a year. It's a nuisance, and even if individuals can plan ahead, and you could argue, well, they have a choice. The truth is that it affects our routines. Our routines are not determined by our rational systems. They are determined, as behavioral economics has established and psychologists have established, that it's determined by automatic systems, right? And those automatic systems might not necessarily align with, our mental sort of time, right? And then finally, it has redistributive effects. So weaker people in society bear most of the cost, and stronger people, healthier people in society reap the benefits. So even from an equity standpoint, I think that is not particularly equitable.
What about the equity issue? Binyamin, Joan has mentioned that a few times.
I mean, I think it's a real and important point. I mean, this is often the case with costs. They're not evenly distributed. And they often tend to concentrate on the people who are least able to bear them. I think it's important to keep in mind the scale of costs that we're talking about here. You, an individual, are very unlikely to experience severe health consequences as a result of the upcoming change in time. In aggregate, across the population, there are measurable negative effects, but the scale of what we're talking about here is not huge. There are many issues where I think, if we're going to invest time as a society in fixing problems, I have a fairly long list of problems I'd want to get to before this one. But to be clear, I think the best argument for using a single system of timekeeping is health, and equity is a part of that.
Very quick question. I just want to shift this very briefly to the framework of time zones, because they also represent a decision that's been made, which arguably is based on reason and thought, but arguably is also somewhat arbitrary. Again, in the United States, the fact that Detroit, Michigan is on the same time zone as Maine, and yet it's in the Midwest, because that's how the line is drawn. And it's not a straight line, and there are places south of Michigan that get an earlier and later sunrise. What is that? Does that sort of flexibility, Binyamin, support your point, or does it support the argument that you're making, Joan, that it's all kind of crazy and we should figure it out? Why don't you go first, Binyamin?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, the history here is instructive. It used to be that every place kept its own time and could sort of center its timekeeping, to the sun. The advent of time zones, is really very close in time to the advent of standardized timekeeping. It was done as commerce began to move too quickly across the landscape. Railroads in particular were responsible for the creation of time zones so that you could have standardized timetables, and as people communicated across distance, they could share time. So it's another imposition of industrialization. It's another way in which we've sort of standardized and organized nature in order to facilitate commerce and modern life. Huge benefits, obviously, but also it imposes real costs on us in much the same way that our system of shifting time twice a year does. The idea that Detroit and Boston, share time is not intuitive and not optimal, in sort of a health sense. It's optimal in a commerce sense. And we're by no means the extreme example of this. In China, Urumqi and Beijing share a time zone. They've decided to impose a single time zone on their entire country for reasons of standardization and organization. So, our time zone system is actually a compromise relative to what you could do in a single nation. But yeah, to me, it's another example of the ways in which we're always making these compromises. And what we really need to be thinking about is just what's the best compromise for our society.
Joan?
I would agree with that. On top of that, I would say that there are political reasons for time zones, and I don't know enough of the history of time zones in the US to comment on it, but clearly in Europe, the existence of a central European time has a clear political purpose, and back in time it had a purpose. Now it has a completely different purpose. We know that the time zones can actually have an impact as well in terms of like holding up, let's say, can have nuisance when it comes to holding up elections, for instance. There is evidence that, for instance, in Turkey, in 2007 or 8, the time of the daylight saving times was changed just to ensure that more people turn up and cast their ballot. So clearly, I would say that they tend to serve other purposes than just focusing on individuals' well-being or welfare. And time zones, they might have served a different purpose back in time than today. And because we are creatures of routine, we tend to stay with the status quo. There is this status quo bias that has been very, very well established. Yeah. And it's very much, this would be very much of an example of it.
All right, we're going to pivot in the program now, and we're going to bring in some voices of people who have been following the conversation so far and know something about the topic and are interested in it. And what we like to do very often is bring in other voices to ask some interesting questions. And I want to start first with Faye Flam. Faye is a science journalist who has written for the New York Times, Science Magazine, Sky and Telescope, has hosted a podcast, and right now has a science column for Bloomberg Opinion. Faye, thanks so much for joining us on Open to Debate. What question do you have for our debaters?
Well, every time I write about this, I talk to scientists and doctors who are very, very narrowly focused on the health effects of the few days when we spring forward. And I wondered if either of you have thought about the possibility that we could keep the time either daylight or standard all year, but then allow businesses and schools to shift their hours, have summer or spring hours and fall winter hours, so that people could get the benefits of the daylight without the time shift.
Hey, is that happening anywhere that you're aware of, either in the U.S. or elsewhere?
I don't know. I think it might be happening in the places that don't do daylight savings time, but it struck me that if we did get rid of it, that a lot of us would want that. I live in New England where, it gets dark at 4:30 in the winter, and we'd get very little outdoor time in the summer if we didn't have our daylight savings time. So I think a lot of people here, because of where we are in the time zone, would really like to have some nice daylight hours in the summer.
It sounds like such an elegant solution. I'm wondering why it's not in effect. But let's let our two debaters respond to that. I see you smiling on this question. Joan, why don't you go first?
Yes, I would completely agree that that's actually my point. So we should not change the time and simply adjust the opening times. And that's already happening. The daylight saving time doesn't really solve the problem, because the idea is that over the year, individuals get different exposure to light, and that opens up the chance of engaging in different kind of social activities. And because light exposure is different across, let's say, if I take Europe, in Southern Europe, it's not unfrequent. It's not uncommon, let's say, for people to have dinner at 10 p.m. While in Northern Europe, it's not uncommon to have dinner at 5 p.m. So there's 5-hour difference of dinner time across Europe, right? So that's already happening by default. So society is always ahead of the government. Society manages to find solutions to problems much more swiftly than governments do. And in this case, because it implies an agreement of a large number of countries. So one of the reasons why this change hasn't happened in Europe, in part, is because of Brexit, because Northern Ireland and, for instance, the rest of the UK would fall into different time zones, and that would create troubles. So, I would say society has already found a solution to these problems. That would be my take.
Very quick question to you, Joan, on that. If a factory announces that they're changing the hours, doesn't that in itself for the individual worker also disrupt the schedule in the same way that a clock change would if they suddenly have to start getting up earlier? Isn't it the same problem?
Well, yeah, so long as it doesn't entail night shifts, it would simply mean that there will be an adjustment in terms of like the bedtimes and wake-up times of that particular individual. But that's probably much better than actually disrupting the sleep of the entire population.
Okay.
So the daylight saving time creates a problem at scale, right? We all agree that there are problems that are individual specific, right?
And you mean your response to Faye's point?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an idea that's been around for a long time. In fact, 100 years before the idea of daylight saving time as we have it was proposed, Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter to a friend in which he suggested that the residents of Paris would be much happier in the summer if they all agreed to wake up an hour earlier. So, yeah, I mean, it certainly realizes the same benefits. I guess to me, it's not clear that it solves any problems because if you did what she is describing, you would, in effect, be accomplishing daylight saving time by another name. It's what you can think of daylight saving time as just a coordination mechanism. It's a agreement across society for everybody to make that shift. And frankly, if you left it up to individual school districts, individual factories, individual daycares, individual retailers, what you would have is chaos, or at least some real coordination problems for workers who needed to report an hour earlier to the factory but had their children at a school that had not adjusted its own time schedule. There is real utility. The reason that Congress legislated this in 1966, made a national law, is that there is real utility in requiring everyone in a particular geographical area to make the same choice. And I think that, allowing everyone to make different choices is suboptimal in that respect. And I would add that it's not obvious to me why it should solve any of the problems that Juan has been talking about. Like, if everyone's life is individually disrupted, I don't know why that adds up to something different than collective disruption.
All right. Thanks, Faye, very much for your question. Now I want to welcome Dan Diamond. And Dan is a journalist whose work over the years has covered issues of public policy and public health. He's currently at the Washington Post, where he is a White House reporter, interesting times, and has been closely following the daylight savings time debate over the past several years. Dan, thanks so much for finding the time to join us with so much going on in Washington right now. Please come in and join us with your question.
Well, President Trump has talked about trying to end daylight saving time, so it remains relevant to my beat. But I will say, as someone who has spent several years reporting on the politics of daylight saving time, both debaters have mentioned this, the broad dissatisfaction with the current system. But I've spoken with lawmakers in Congress who say they can't get consensus on a new system. And 50 years ago, when we tried as a nation to end the clock changes and have year-round daylight saving time, that was a political disaster. So understanding that we might be stuck with this as the status quo, I'm curious, is there anything that we could do to make daylight saving time more palatable around the edges? Could we adopt a more gradual shift, for instance, to daylight saving time so it doesn't feel as harsh? Or should we be thinking about this more around questions of latitude rather than longitude?
Dan, can I just ask for clarification? When you say do it more gradually, would you mean phase in a shift of a full hour over a few weeks?
I think it could be It could be more gradual in several ways. It could be rather than the one big change in the spring and the fall, maybe there are smaller changes throughout the year. Or perhaps it could be rather than Sunday morning, we are shifting forward. It's Saturday morning and it's a 3-day weekend. It's a federal holiday on Monday, so we have a little bit more time to adjust ourselves before going back to work and school on Tuesday morning.
Oh, really interesting ideas. Joan, can you take that one first?
Yeah, I would agree that this is a catch-22 situation, right? So you cannot really move forward, backwards, or stay still. Right? So inevitably there will have to be a compromise, and there will be winners and losers, and somebody will have to be the winner, and somebody will have to be the loser, and there will have to be compensation effects. One way to go, I fully agree, would be to make it smoother. I mean, in fact, one of the main problems of the daylight saving time, the time change, is that humans are used to like progressive changes in light exposure. So by making it progressive, that would smooth out the costs and make it more variable. So in that respect, the health effects might potentially maybe not disappear, but they would become even smaller than the effects that exist today. So I think that would be generally a good idea. Problem is that it will make it even harder to coordinate, right? Because if you had to do it, let's say, in a quarter of an hour every week, many people would find that really, really hard to do, and eventually there will be like mismatches happening and chaos. Micro chaos. So the question is, do we want macro chaos or micro chaos? And it might create lots of micro chaos. That would be my take.
Yeah, I love the question. I think it's a great thing to think about. And I wish I knew a way to minimize those effects. I think the idea of doing it incrementally strikes me as just a recipe for chaos. I mean, I have enough trouble keeping track of, the time changes when we're moving the hour hand. If we start moving the minute hand, God help us all. The 3-day weekend's an interesting idea. I'm always down for a 3-day weekend. But I don't know. I think it's a great question to ask, because I tend to agree that the current system has a lot of staying power. And so the question of whether we can do it better than we're doing it seems to me a really important issue to consider.
And just the fact that we have you here and you've been studying this for years, I think is a great opportunity for us. I've had to do some Zoom work with India, which is on a half hour. Part of India is on a half hour time zone shift, not top of the hour. And I have found it really confusing, which may mean that I'm just not that smart, but it kind of suggests a more nuanced approach in terms of time, but it's kind of confusing to somebody as a human being. And I'm wondering, if that's what you're suggesting in terms of being more gradual, or are you talking about being gradual in terms of a phase-in of the time switch?
I tend to lean toward the 3-day weekend idea, just because I think that would be the easiest adjustment. We'd still be shifting 1 hour. There would be more kind of a soft landing of changing over. But as a parent of a toddler who has done sleep training, there is something to perhaps doing 15 minutes or 30 minutes of phasing someone at a time rather than 1 hour overnight. I also think, just having spoken to the politicians who have at times pushed for changes, there are such strong constituencies that push back on anything that is done. I have resigned myself to no major change as a political reporter unless there is some real force of popular will that arises that we haven't seen before.
And I understand also, I don't actually recall this happening, though I was, a young adult at the time, but that during when the United States was hit with an energy crisis because of an Arab oil embargo, that for a full year, the U.S. went, I believe, full-time daylight savings time. Do you recall how that turned out, Dan?
Well, that was the political backlash of 50 years ago, where it was seen as a way to save energy and a way to avoid the clock changes. People were celebrating that they wouldn't have to do the spring forward or fall back. And almost immediately there was backlash. There were kids waiting in the dark in January to be picked up for school. And there were car accidents that occurred. It just led to, whether some of the blame was overstated and people were using it as a scapegoat, it became a cause célèbre in Congress. There were perhaps hundreds of bills. I don't have the data in front of me, but many lawmakers sought almost immediately to roll back this daylight saving time change. And when I spoke to some of the older lawmakers in Congress, they recalled this. I spoke to Frank Pallone. I think I talked to Nancy Pelosi or her office about this. And they were aware that the last time Congress had tried to make this year-round change, it backfired. So I think there is hesitation in the political system because when we tried a year-round daylight saving time before, it didn't work.
Yeah, I understand that there were 8 children in Florida were car accident fatalities during this period. Whether those can be attributed to the fact that it was dark out, of course, is speculative, but that evidence is often cited as a reason that experiment was not very popular as part of it. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate your questions and your insight. I want to bring back, before we get to our closing statements, back to you, Joan. Just to be clear, I think when you're saying let's stop switching, let's keep with one, the one you want to keep with is standard because it's closest to wake up when the sun comes up. Am I correct about that?
Well, I would say yes if it was just me. And that's if we were only to care about health, definitely standard time would be the one that we should pick.
Because,
having said that,
can you say why? Just so we're clear on that.
Well, it's just because you get more light exposure in the morning, and that basically optimizes your circadian rhythm. But it's true that if you look at people's preference, if you were to run a referendum, daylight saving time would probably win, and that is the let's say the paradox there, no? That and that explains why there's been little action so far, because it seems that different countries, for instance in Europe, would lobby for different options, different let's say alternatives, and it creates a situation of standstill. No? I mean that there's lack of agreement. That in my opinion could be solved if those losers would be able to get some compensation out of the agreement, which would entail changes in opening hours that perhaps would not be like the ones that have been traditionally in place, but at least we would all benefit as a country.
So you're saying that if we were going to go to one and there were a vote, most people would vote for daylight savings time.
Yes.
And that's because it sounds like because they would agree with Binyamin that it's great to have the extra light at the end of the day. Okay, so you're conceding that actually is the preference, but that's very, very intellectually honest of you. Just a little bit.
Exactly.
Binyamin, if we had to go to one or the other, I'm sure that you would go for summertime. I know you don't want to choose, but if you had to choose, you would choose summertime.
I don't know what I'd choose. I think it would depend on, where I was living. I think different geographies require different solutions. The problem, if you let countries in Europe, for example, you'd essentially end up with a new map of time zones that, might look more like a checkerboard than the confused lines that are already there. I think it depends. I don't know. I like the current system is the bottom line. Okay. I think it's better to have both.
All right. Let's move on to our closing round. And our closing round is where each of you makes a standalone statement briefly to tell us why, one more time, you're answering yes or no to our question. Joan, you are up first one more time for your closing to explain to us why you would say it is time to end daylight savings time.
Well, my main point is that humans are not robots. Our decisions are mainly driven by habits and routines that happen to be affected by time changes. And even if we are not aware of those detrimental effects, they still exist. And if you ask actually Americans, what would they do with 1 extra hour? What you get is an answer that they would basically sleep it. So most of us are sleep deprived. We tend to be time poor. So we would do with actually an extra hour, and that explains why limiting our time creates problems of anxiety, which is about managing your time. It does create problems of depression. There's effects on suicides, reductions in productivity, car accidents, right? That would be my first point. My second closing point would have to do with the fact that we all have a right of time, a right to the time, right? And the daylight saving time change is an unnecessary intrusion to our social life, and it happens twice a year, and we could actually do without it. And then finally, this is a very real effect. I mean, it's not just grumpiness, or it's, some people tend to dismiss it as not very important, but actually it is a very real effect that entails a trade-off between commercial and political interests and the well-being of families. And when it comes to those kind of trade-offs, I tend to align with the well-being of individuals and families, because most of the problems that the time change actually solves can be solved through other mechanisms, like, for instance, changing the opening times, as discussed. And this, in part, is already happening in many European countries. So that would be my take.
Thank you, Joan. And Binyamin, you get the last word one more time. Why you would argue no, that we should not be ending daylight savings time.
Yeah, listen, my argument also boils down to the fact that humans are not robots, and that we don't always do the thing that might be absolutely optimal for our health or for efficiency or for our society. And daylight saving time is an example of that. It is something that emerged as an idea because people wanted more time in the sunshine. It has endured because people continue to want more time in the sunshine. And I think that, despite the health effects, which are not huge but are real, people have made this choice and ought to be able to make this choice. And until someone demonstrates that there's a democratic majority in favor of another system, I don't really see why we would want to, or we should change the current system. It's an interesting fact that when Congress created this system in 1966, it offered every state the option to opt out of it, and only 3 states did so. Hawaii, which makes perfect sense because at that latitude, there's no reason to have daylight saving time. Arizona, which also is, pretty far south as such things go, and Indiana. I actually don't know the history of why Indiana did it, but the important thing to know is that they eventually changed their mind and joined the rest of the country in having daylight saving time. In 1986 and again in 2005, Congress voted democratically to expand daylight saving time, again, because people like it and want it and favor it. And even today, as Juan suggests, if people had their druthers and had to choose one system, they would probably choose daylight saving time. I understand it's never popular to favor a compromise, but this is the case where a compromise is the right option. Switching time twice a year remains the best system for our society.
Thank you very much, Binyamin. And that is a wrap on this debate. I want to thank both of you, Joan and Binyamin, for taking part, especially as we're at that time of year where we're now, all struggling through that transition to get that more daylight at night. You gave us a lot to think about, and I think we also learned a lot throughout the process. So I want to thank you both for taking part. I also want to thank Faye and Dan for their excellent questions that took this conversation to even more interesting places. And I want to say a big thank you to our audience for tuning into this episode of Open to Debate. Thanks for listening to the arguments and for thinking about what was said. This has been a special daylight saving time episode we put together for our podcast and YouTube channel. Daylight saving time is this weekend, so please do not forget to move your clocks forward this Sunday, March 9th. And don't forget to rate and review us wherever you listen. As a nonprofit working to combat extreme polarization through civil debate, our work is made possible by listeners like you and by the Rosencrantz Foundation and by supporters of Open to Debate. Robert Rosencrantz is our chairman. Our CEO is Clea Connor. Leah Mathau is our chief content officer. Elizabeth Kitzenberg is our chief advancement officer. Michelle DeBrasini is our director of marketing. This episode was produced by Alexis Pangrazi and Marlette Sandoval. Research by Gabriella Mayer. Andrew Lipson and Max Fulton provided production support. The Open to Debate team also includes Annalisa Cochran, Gabrielle Iannicelli, Rachel Kemp, Eric Gross, Linda Lee, Mary Regas, Tom Bunting, and Vlad Virtanen. Damon Whittemore mixed this episode. Our theme music is by Alex Clement, and I'm John Donvan. We'll see you next time on Open to Debate.